What if China never became communist? History is filled with crossroads, pivotal moments where the trajectory of nations and the fate of millions are decided. One such moment for China came in 1949 as Mao Zedong led the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, to victory in the Chinese Civil War, establishing the People's Republic of China. But what if this moment never happened? What if China never became communist? In this speculative exploration, we'll reimagine history, unwinding the threads of communism from China's narrative to examine how the country, Asia, and the world might look today. China in the early 20th century was a nation in turmoil. The Qing dynasty had collapsed, leaving a power vacuum. In its place arose competing factions, most prominently the Nationalist Party, Kuomintang or KMT, under Chiang Kai-shek, and the Chinese Communist Party under Mao. The CCP's eventual rise was propelled by its promises of land reform, the egalitarian allure of communism, and support from a disillusioned rural peasantry. But what if those factors had turned out differently? Let's imagine the Kuomintang emerged victorious, or perhaps another form of governance arose to take the place of communism in shaping China's future. If the Kuomintang had held on to power, China might have pursued a nationalist capitalist model of governance. However, the KMT had major shortcomings. It was plagued by corruption, internal factions, and weak popular support, particularly among rural communities. One possibility is that a KMT-led China may have continued to face periodic uprisings and internal unrest, struggling to unify its diverse population. Another scenario might envision a military dictatorship or semi-democratic experiment arising, as seen in South Korea's post-war history. Alternatively, regional warlords who held sway over vast territories might have retained significant influence, creating conditions for prolonged fragmentation akin to a failed state. Would the KMT have managed to centralize power without the ideological cohesion Mao provided through communism? One of the CCP's most defining policies under Mao was land redistribution. This effectively turned millions of landless peasants into supporters of the regime. Without communist policies, how would the rural population, China's majority at the time, have fared? Under the KMT, reforms might have been less radical or delayed altogether. This may have widened economic inequality, leaving an already volatile rural population feeling even more alienated. It's possible that agrarian unrest and peasant-driven uprisings might have been a recurring issue, dragging the nation into cycles of crisis. On the other hand, the absence of rigid collectivization policies, such as those seen under Mao during the Great Leap Forward, could have resulted in an agricultural system better aligned with market principles, avoiding the devastating famine caused by centralized planning. Industrialization is often seen as a hallmark of modern China's rise, but in this alternate history, the path to industrial growth would likely have looked very different. Without Maoist-era central planning, China's economy may have resembled the capitalist models of South Korea or Japan. Hypothetically, foreign investment could have spurred economic development, with businesses flourishing under a market-based system. However, this path assumes political stability, which the KMT historically struggled to achieve. Without economic and political cohesion, industrialization might have been concentrated in coastal cities, leaving China's heartland further behind and exacerbating internal disparities. It's also possible that corruption within KMT bureaucracies could have hindered meaningful progress, dooming China to stagnation for much of the mid-20th century. The absence of a communist China would profoundly alter the Cold War's global dynamics. After 1949, China became a pivotal player in Cold War politics, aligning first with the Soviet Union and later charting its own path as a rival communist power. In a non-communist scenario, China's foreign policy might have looked markedly different. Under the KMT, China could have aligned with the United States and Western allies against the Soviet Union. This scenario would have potentially shifted the balance of power in Asia, perhaps even altering the outcomes of conflicts like the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Without Maoist support, would North Korea have survived as a communist state? Would the United States have relied on China as a stabilizing force in the region instead of confronting it as an adversary? In our timeline, the KMT retreated to Taiwan after their defeat in the Chinese Civil War, turning the island into an economic success story and a democratic stronghold. But if the KMT had retained control over mainland China, Taiwan's history could have unfolded in several ways. The island might have remained integrated with mainland China, never emerging as a separate political entity. Alternatively, Taiwan might still have played a significant role as an economic engine for a KMT-led China, albeit without the independence and democratic identity it holds today. Would the global semiconductor industry, for which Taiwan is a cornerstone, exist in its current form if Taiwan's path had been more tightly bound to a less economically developed mainland? A world without communist China would also mean a world without some of Mao's most catastrophic policies. The Great Leap Forward, a disastrous attempt at rapid industrialization, resulted in widespread famine and millions of deaths. Without Mao's leadership, it's plausible that these human and economic costs could have been avoided. Similarly, the Cultural Revolution, a decade-long campaign to eliminate bourgeois elements and critics of the regime, might never have occurred. The absence of such purges could have preserved China's cultural heritage, strengthened its intellectual institutions, and fostered a less repressive environment for artistic and academic growth. China's Communist Revolution inspired other movements in the region, from Vietnam's Communist Party to Cambodia's Khmer Rouge. Without the support and ideological example of a communist China, it's conceivable that some of these regimes and movements might never have reached power. Additionally, neighboring countries like India and Japan would likely have engaged differently with a non-communist China. The Sino-Indian border conflicts and decades of uneasy relations between China and Japan might have been replaced with more cooperative regional dynamics, particularly if China and the U.S. enjoyed closer ties. Could China still have emerged as a global superpower without its communist revolution? It's entirely possible that a capitalist or mixed system could have positioned China for growth earlier, particularly if foreign investment and trade connections were prioritized earlier in its development. However, the centralized authority and mobilization that the CCP provided, crucially during Mao's leadership and later under Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms, were significant factors in shaping China's rapid rise. Without a strong central government to oversee its transformation, China might have lagged behind for much longer, vulnerable to internal fragmentation and foreign exploitation. The absence of a communist China would have reshaped not only Asia, but also the global order. Without the ideological conflict between the US and China during the Cold War, the ideological landscape of the 20th century might have been far less polarizing. Similarly, global trade dynamics would look very different today, particularly if a capitalist China entered the world economy much earlier. The ripple effects could extend to technology, diplomacy, and even culture. Without China's communist identity, its nationalist policies and global competition with the US might never have materialized in the same way. Instead of being perceived as an adversary, China might have been regarded as an ally to the Western world amid evolving 20th and 21st century challenges. In contemplating the alternate reality of a non-communist China, one thing is clear. The course of history hinges on fragile, decisive moments. While imagining a post-1949 China free of communism offers tantalizing prospects of avoided tragedies and accelerated development, it also raises unsettling questions about stability, unity, and resilience. Would a capitalist or nationalist-led China have avoided internal bloodshed, or would it have succumbed to chaos under the weight of its many challenges? Could it have become a global leader, or might it have remained vulnerable to foreign exploitation and regional disintegration? Ultimately, this speculative exercise reminds political analysts that history is malleable, deeply interconnected, and always ripe for re-evaluation. Like and subscribe for more from History Twist.